Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of boards, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series. Take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the 6th level adventure, The Fires of Rephilon, designed by Liam Pádraig for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. Dragons have become kind of a rarity in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, ironically. So when we actually get to see a dragon adventure, especially a relatively short adventure, it's kind of exciting and novel. However, I will say, do not necessarily judge this one by the cover, although the cover is very badass looking. It is not a typical dragon slaying adventure. In fact, the dragon is actually a surprise boss fight who appears at the end. It does the whole disguised dragon thing, which we don't actually see a whole lot of also in 5. You typically just roll across a dragon and end up fighting her. They just talk to you in dragon form. You don't usually get the manipulative scheming, I'm really a dragon this whole time thing, which is exactly what we do get here. I think this is a really, really good, cool, fun adventure. It's shockingly short, which I didn't even realize it until I got through and looked at the page count, because it doesn't feel short, which is pretty interesting. It has a very meaty, awesome, fun dungeon crawl, which the way to my heart is through a well-designed dungeon. And I just love how it has all these really memorable scenes that I can see playing out and being really effective and fun to experience in Dungeons & Dragons. So it takes place in Rephilon, which I'm going to assume is the designer's original island they've created. It's off the Sword Coast, a couple hundred miles near Waterdeep, I suppose. And you get a quest from some Waterdavian nobles to rescue their daughter, who has been taken in by a cult or a sect. Now, this isn't your usual cultist kidnapped person. You have to go rescue them. This is a offshoot of an existing group of worshippers for Tymora, which is an established deity in the Forgotten Realms of Faerun. And they've been led by this prophet to say, we're going to be a more extreme version of followers of Tymora by basically being thrill seekers and seeking out dangerous things, and then coming out on top, proving ourselves to be, the luckiest or the most with luck, because it's the goddess of fortune. And they set up shop at this island, a secluded island, which is, of course, never a suspect location for cults to set up shop in. And the goal is to go and rescue this young woman who has kind of fallen in with this group, as she was a former acolyte, a cleric in training for Tymora. So I always like the rescue mission ones, because that adds a personal stake to things, and usually that ends up benefiting later when you have to realize what trouble that person's in, or that person can become either a victim or a survivor or a confidant or an ally or something. So the first job is for the players to travel to Rephilon, and they get to the town of Horizon, where they can basically learn about, it's a very small fishing village, and they just learn about this cult and the fact that they are, thrill-seeking, adrenaline junkies. I wish the designer had done a little bit more with this. We get kind of one scene that almost reminds me of the one from Midsommar, with the people jumping off. It's kind of a freaky moment, and I was kind of hoping that the designer would do a few more scenes like that. Instead, there's just one optional encounter where you meet a young halfling who's trying to ride a giant boar, and it ends up being a combat encounter, and the players can then further learn this person's all about just, oh yeah, I gotta do what I can to prove myself to that I were part of this group and the best in trying to discover how lucky we are, I guess. And then we move on to talking to the cult, which is set up shop around tar pits, which is also pretty suspect. And it turns out they're gearing up for this big, what do they call it? The Great Wager. So they've been doing these things called gambles, which, again, goddess of luck. So they've been trying to be very risky in all these different aspects and tasks. And now they're gearing up for this Great Wager, which is absolutely the end result of a mass sacrifice of a cult, that the entire group is going to partake in. So that should have alarm bells ringing. The party doesn't really have anything they can do at this point, though, other than learning from everybody, talking to everybody, including the prophet. They actually meet Linnea, which is the woman they're trying to find. So it's, and she's even starting to have doubts about this whole thing. So it's not even a question of that she's been, fully brainwashed or that she's captured or anything like that. She's good to go. The problem is, of course, love. She's fallen in love with a very handsome dude who is also fallen in with this cult, and he has been sent out along with several others to go retrieve an artifact from a nearby temple at the request of the prophet, because it's just an ancient time-worn artifact that the prophet is looking to grab. So then we transition into a dungeon crawl. So far it's been fine. You know, it hasn't been wowing me at all. But I've enjoyed the whole cult thing, and the fact that it's not your typical evil cult. It's more like you kind of have to discover like the weirdness of the cult, and you know, what's the end game here, and is it a dangerous thing that we need to worry about. But then we transition to the dungeon crawl, and this is when the adventure gets really freaking good. Now, I've already said I love my dungeon crawls, and this one I think has just a really, really great one, because it combines a rescue mission with the entire party that was sent. So the boyfriend, Sorrel, along with 4 others, were sent to retrieve this artifact. And I love when you combine that with the dungeon crawl, because it adds role-playing, it adds environmental storytelling. You've already got your task built in that you have to go rescue these people. You could find bodies, you could find barricades, you can find traps set up, and and obviously survivors, and it makes a dungeon automatically feel more active and reactive and more lived in when it's not just a bunch of monsters waiting around for the players to show up. You know, it feels like there's tracks you can find, there's traps that have been maybe set off, there's barricades that have been pushed into doors. It just feels like you're really coming into an active war zone kind of situation, but in a dungeon atmosphere. And that's exactly what has happened here, and I really, really enjoy that. Right off the bat, pretty early, you can find one of the survivors on the first floor who can, kind of talk about a little bit about what happened, and then 2 others that were killed, being currently eaten by minotaurs, which I never pictured a minotaur as somebody who feasts on the flesh of sentient beings. Aren't those like bull people? Imagine they'd be vegetarians, but maybe not. So it's a pretty grisly, creepy scene. There's a number of traps to get through. I really like that in one of the rooms there are columns that are very, half destroyed and ready to collapse. And either the Minotaurs or the party could take advantage of that if they lure the Minotaurs into that room, thereby causing like parts of the entire ceiling to collapse. I thought that was a pretty cool way of doing with a trap. And then later on, the players do find one that's in worse shape, to where I believe it's damaged as soon as they actually walk around in there. A foreshadowing of the trap. Then we can get down to the basement level where, and unfortunately I can show you the maps. I guess they're at the very end. The maps are not great. We do get maps, which is good, but the first level is a Dice and Logos map, and the second level, it says made with Dungeon Scroll. So 2 problems here. One, obviously I don't like maps that are just kind of that black and white graph paper map. That doesn't really work for me, who's somebody who works primarily with virtual tabletops. And B, the designer oddly used 2 different map styles for the same dungeon crawl. I've already complained about other adventures that even use different maps for different locations. This one uses different maps for the same location, which is really nasty looking, so I was not a fan of that. But that being said, we can stomach it because I think it's a really great dungeon design. We make it down to the lower level. We've already got 2 diverging paths we can crawl in. There's a venom troll lurking in room 11. There's a bunch of sarcophagus that we can dig through in room 14, including a key that we might need, or we will need. In room 15, this giant one with the black tar pit in the middle, there's a tar kraken, which is a new original creature that's very much like a mini boss fight. Again, 6th level, kind of an interesting level. The players are getting stronger, but they can still be quite challenged. I mean, tier 2 is probably the most popular region area for D&D to adventure in, because of both the DM feels like they can use a lot of things and the players feel like they can use a lot of things. I really like this tar kraken. Sounds very cool. And there's all these rules about, hey, if you set this tar on fire, if somebody were to, light a torch or shoot a fireball in there, then guess what? That whole freaking thing lights up and starts dealing continuous damage, which is probably good for the players unless they're being grappled by said tar kraken. Then it gets pretty horrendously crazy. There's another dead body in area 14, one of the other people that were the expedition that obviously went horribly awry. And then finally they find the Sorrel character in, I believe it's room 16 or 17, and then they discover a room full of ghosts, which were from way back when this ruins was still a temple, and they're just still playing cards, which I thought was a really creepy, fun thing to do, and the players can just sit down and play cards with them. And if they win the game, then they can earn a key. Now, if you noticed, I mentioned 2 keys. There's only one locked door here, which is in room 18, that the players have to get into to actually get their MacGuffin artifact. I thought that's actually a very smart design decision. If you're going to lock a door and say, hey, in order to progress this adventure, you need to get beyond this locked door, that is a smart decision, is to put the key the players need in 2 different locations. The same key. It's not like you need both keys to turn it. It's not some nuclear launch thing. It's, you can just need either key and either key will work. So I thought that was really a great idea, and encourages the players to split up and doesn't punish them for just not having to go in this one room to find the one thing that they need. So I thought it was a really fun dungeon crawl. Again, it's a huge room. What is that, 18 or 19 rooms big. Like, just, there's a lot going on, a lot of cool, memorable scenes, and a good mix of combat as well as traps, hazards, exploration, and role playing with the 2 survivors you come across. Just, it feels very, very satisfying from a dungeon crawl standpoint. So I thought, just huge thumbs up on that dungeon crawl. Then we've got the boyfriend, we've got the artifact that we need. So we return, and then we end up with the big showdown. Now it turns out the prophet is actually a red dragon in disguise, which is a pretty big shock, because we don't actually see a whole lot of disguised dragons running around in D&D. If I were a D&D purist or Forgotten Realms purist, I would probably arch an eyebrow, like, wait a minute, do red dragons really do this? Where they're like manipulating cults and scheming and all this? I thought they were kind of the brutish, violent dragons. But on the other hand, it's kind of more fun to have dragons all have different personalities and things as well. So I'm just happy to see a surprise dragon boss fight in the end. But first, we can have a little social conflict, which is interesting. So basically, the players, the dragon is trying to lead her followers into the tar pits, where she then drops a torch and kills everybody because she's just in it for the treasure. And that's the whole big thing about this cult, is it's just a classic grift. She's just been recruiting people, and they've all been bringing their treasures from the temples, and she's just been trying to build her hoard that way. It's kind of a convoluted process to do it, but ultimately relatively safe for her. And her whole goal is to just kill all them in a classic, very dark, like mass cult suicide, or at least make it look like a mass cult suicide. But the players have a chance to convince the followers not to do that, and there's not really necessarily a mechanical benefit to that. It's just you get to not experience the horror of a bunch of people walking to the tar pits and then vaporizing and getting vaporized. And it is not a suicide, to be clear. It's the dragon actually drops her torch and kills them all. Or she, still bursts into her boss form, but then they don't all die if the players do a good job with the social challenge. So that was pretty cool. I would probably argue you don't necessarily have to even do, because one prospect of these kind of 4th edition inspired skill challenges and things is that it kind of makes it a little too dicey, a little too mathy to do something that should be a really compelling story moment. And I think what 5e does well is just maybe let people role play, maybe include a persuasion check in there or something. So that's something I would always include maybe as a note, rather than designing this too much. You can still have cool ideas, which is what I think the designer does do with the skill challenge, which I think, if I'm reading it correctly, it's just a boss fight, but if the players want to, they could just flee the dragon. But if they do, then that results in some consequences where, the dragon's killing different survivors, or maybe even torching some of the village or something while they're trying to escape, based on how they do on this skill challenge. So I think in that case, it's probably a pretty good one, because it results in some interesting consequences instead of just a pass-fail system, which is where I think skill challenges need to, they get caught up in that level, where it's instead you need like multiple grades of what is happening with that. So I think it works pretty well. The surprise dragon boss fight, again, this is not a dragon slaying adventure. This just happens to be where it's, instead of fighting an evil cultist who has some kind of cult powers, it's just a fucking dragon who transforms into a dragon and says, well, now that I've got my horde, I don't need these people anymore, and I can just kind of kill all of you and be done with it. I think it's still very satisfying. It's again, shockingly short. 15 pages is where we're at right now, and yet, because that dungeon crawl is so meaty and we have some decently meaningful social encounters with the cult early on, it feels like it's not short. It feels like there's enough, plenty of content here, and I appreciate that there's a nice little epilogue section where it talks about what kind of rewards the players get from Waterdeep, or maybe consequences they suffer if the island was torched, and then what kind of loot obviously they can get from the dragon's hoard, which is always good. So I really like this adventure. I was shocked that the designer said this was their first adventure that they released. I believe they released another one since this one came out on the DM's Guild. I think it's extremely well edited, well organized. It's very nicely presented. I had no complaints about how it's giving me that information, and considering it's such a short adventure and yet tells a very complete story and has a great dungeon crawl, really have almost nothing but good things to say about it. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for the Fires of Rephilon. Pro: the Domus Fortuna, which is the name of the big temple ruin dungeon crawl, is an excellent dungeon crawl with a balanced mix of role-playing, traps, combat, investigation, and exploration. I can't say enough good things about how well this dungeon is designed. I absolutely love it. If anything, I could recommend this dungeon. If you're not going to use the adventure, you could just pull that dungeon concept and run that dungeon crawl by itself, and that would be a pretty effective higher level one shot, I would say. And you could use the Tar Kraken as a boss fight or something. Like, it just worked really well. Pro: epic finale with a surprise dragon transformation and possible mass sacrifice. I thought it had a pretty epic scene here where it should be very shocking that it turns out the prophet is just a dragon who's in it for the money and wealth, and then it allows some kind of social scenes for the players to still convince the followers, like, don't follow this crazy person into the tar, that's a bad idea. And then some cool, interesting skill challenges for if you want to flee the dragon and try to escape, maybe with survivors because you're worried that they would get caught in the dragon breath or something. Then that's all that is presented here. And pro: it's well edited and cleanly organized. And by that, I mean it is very easy to read. Look at how, something to be said about the actual layout of an adventure. And look at the spacing between bullet points. Like, while it would be nice to have some flavor text, we don't get any room-to-room flavor text. I also don't feel like that's necessary for every single room. I would have liked to have some of that, like the read aloud, the DM reads this part. But the way it's organized with all these bullet points makes it very easy to parse out the most important information rather than trying to dig through paragraphs. So I would say that's a boon for this adventure and makes it really easy for me to get all the information that I need and very quickly out of this adventure. Cons: I was going to include the maybe underdeveloped cult at the beginning, but I thought it did just enough information to make it not a con. But I will include that as an aside. Like, I do wish maybe the middle and the end are great. I think the beginning, that first act, maybe could have used another scene or so of just cultists doing like extreme challenge things, or maybe more things along the way where you see more scenes of that, just to kind of paint a better picture. But I didn't include that as a con because I thought it was fine enough. But the one I will include as a con is ultimately, of course, the dungeon maps. I appreciate, obviously, always somebody giving me maps, but so much of this adventure relies on the dungeon crawl map. And, again, as somebody who runs on a virtual tabletop, none of this is usable. I don't like this art in general, and the fact that it's two different map styles is very clashing and awkward. Honestly, if this had been a really gorgeous, detailed, like full color map, this would probably be one of my favorite adventures, not only of this year, but probably one of the best ones that I've reviewed on the DM's Guild, which is a pretty long list. I've really enjoyed this adventure. Final verdict: a suspicious cult, a rescue mission, a meaty dungeon crawl, and a surprise boss fight. The Fires of Rephilon have everything I love in a straightforward, well-designed adventure. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel, and you can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Shouts to Platinum patrons: Joe, Will, Thomas, Adam, Stan, William, I'm Loud, Brandon, Genocider, David, Eclectic, Role Player Roll, Christopher, and Dig Dug DM. And gold patrons: RPG Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard, Lion, Sam, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, Scott, and Humanoid Sized Sphincters. Thank you all very much for your support.